Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. We're going to talk about the U.S. economy and its role in the global economy. You know everyone who's on stage, so I'll dispense with the introductions. I'd like to start off by asking about the shutdown, which looks like it's unlikely to happen today. I grew up in Ireland where a shutdown happened at 11 o'clock at night when you were kicked out of the pubs and sent home. It's a little bit different in Washington.
We can't do that?
You can't do that. Is the debate or the congressional wrangling about the budget, be it today or in 2 months' time, the controversy over the debt ceiling and how and when that should be raised, is that something that has an impact on the American economy, or is it just political theater that we can ignore? Jason.
I think there's been a lot of attention to the question of will the government be open tomorrow or will the government not be open tomorrow? And the fact that we might be on track to passing a spending bill is a lot better than if we didn't, but it's not exactly a major accomplishment. And what's really important is not just whether you're continuing the appropriations, but how you're continuing them. Mm-hmm. And if we continue spending at the sequester levels or a CR level for the next year, we would have inflation-adjusted spending lower than it's been since 2006. We have a bigger population. We have veterans' health costs that are twice as big as they were then. So it would actually be a large cut in spending. It would mean per pupil spending in education would be back to where it was in 2000, 1,000 fewer grants in NSF and NIH, cuts across the board that the Congressional Budget Office said would take 0.4% off our growth rate next year. That's twice what Goldman Sachs said the turmoil in China would cost the U.S. economy. So I think a first-order question is not are we continuing, but are we ending the sequester? Are we buying it out and making the investments that we need for our short and long-run economy?
Doug, would you agree with that?
I think the CR is a non-event. A tiny shutdown economically is not a big deal. The great battle is over. What do we do in the appropriations, both on the non-defense side, but also on the defense side, I mean, where if we continue at CR levels, there are deep concerns about readiness and capabilities, and the Pentagon folks really don't like that idea. So that's the big and important battle. But to be honest, of the three things you mentioned, the biggest one's the debt limit. I mean, every time we run up to this limit and we threaten the liquidity of treasuries, we threaten the financial underpinnings of the world financial system, and that's just silly and shouldn't happen.
And I'll only add to that point that it's a particularly volatile market right now, as we know, and it's likely to stay a particularly volatile market. The markets have been spooked by a perception that the Chinese leadership is making mistakes, and no one expected them to make these kinds of mistakes. So there's a lot of risk premia in the marketplace right now, a lot of uncertainty. And then this debt limit sort of walking up to the brink, and then, well, they're probably not going to jump off of it, but maybe. It's dangerous circumstances to play this game.
Well, I'd like to ask you all a little bit about China in a few minutes, but just to jump in more on that point. I mean, people look at what's happened in China over the summer and they worry about economic mismanagement or poor communication. But I've just come back from living in China for 6 years, and when the Chinese government look at Washington and Congress, they see something that happens every year. And so what impact do you think what's happening or not happening here is having on the image of the US around the world? And then how does that factor into the global economy? Jason?
I certainly look at Congress and sometimes have that feeling myself. There's no way that debating Planned Parenthood for 2 months helped the U.S. economy. In fact, it put us in a position that we weren't debating what we should be debating.
The things you say, Jason.
What we should be figuring out is how much are we going to invest in infrastructure and how should we pay for it? How much do we want to invest in the National Institute of Health? How much, how do we want to move our economy forward? And some of those things we're going to have a difference of opinion on. Some of those we're going to have the same opinion. All of those you're willing to compromise on, but let's have that conversation about our growth.
That kind of political debate goes on all the time. I think countries are used to the U.S. having, its representative system and the two-party system. I think the bigger communication problem has been the Fed. And financial markets are the fastest transmission. And I think the Fed, quite frankly, has just has left everybody confused and themselves confused. Because I would guess that if we had perfect vision and we knew exactly what unemployment and inflation and GDP would be for the next 2 years, we couldn't agree on when the Fed would raise and how much. No one has a clue what they're up to, and maybe not even them.
So if you were running,
That's bad internationally.
if you were running the Fed, what would you do differently?
I certainly believe that they had made the case to raise at the last meeting, and they should have. And to not change the sort of diagnosis to be fundamentally about the rest of the world, no longer about the sort of recovery in the U.S., and then to realize they'd confused everybody and send Janet out to clean up, I mean, that just doesn't look good.
So I really completely disagree with that. I think that inflation and growth and unemployment. Inflation, sorry, no evidence of its pickup. The inflationary expectations have actually, if anything, according to some numbers, recently been moving down, not up. So they didn't have to move on their dual mandate. They have always said that global financial market circumstances have to be taken into account in the timing of a decision. These were not ideal global market circumstances in which to raise rates. I really don't think so. I think that actually, interestingly enough, a number of people pushing the Fed to raise rates were pushing the Fed to raise rates because they felt that global asset prices around the world were inflated. Global asset prices were coming down. They were on their way down. The inflation, the bubble, had been pricked to some extent by what China had done. So I actually think China made some really egregious policy errors. For example, even if they want to take a move to free up the renminbi to move to a reserve currency, they did it in a very botched way at the wrong time. Right goal, wrong moment. The Fed has the right goal, and they chose not to move because it was the wrong moment to move. So I think they've been very clear, and I think they made the right decision.
Can I ask you about the labour market? I mean, the jobless rate has come down, but labour market participation is also relatively low. Why is it that when the US economy is recovering, we have so many people leaving the labour market, and what should Jason be doing to fix this?
Well, Jason, you've done a lot on these numbers.
The Council of Economic Advisors has done extensive research on this question, and the single biggest factor is simply a demographic change, that the population is getting older, and when you're 70, 75, you're less likely to work than when you're 40 or 45, and that explains the majority of the decline
Unless you're
in labor
Donald
force
Trump.
participation.
Yeah.
Unless you're Donald
Trump. There is some additional decline above and beyond that, but what's concerning is that additional decline is at pretty much the same rate that the labor force participation rate had been declining for decades. For prime-age men, their labor force, that's age 25 to 54, their labor force participation has been declining almost every year since the 1950s. And for women, was partly offsetting that as they surged into labor force. That ended in the late 1990s. So I think we do, as a country, have a serious structural challenge when it comes to getting people into the labor force. I don't think, though, it's a byproduct of this business cycle.
But does that mean that the only answer is more immigration, which is obviously a very controversial issue right now in the presidential campaign?
Immigration certainly would help, but so would more flexible workplaces, better child care, reducing the taxes on secondary earners, which is an idea we've put forward and you've heard in the political campaigns from both parties, and just better training and connecting people to jobs, a whole range of things to make labor markets function better.
So on women, we were the country that led up the most rapid increase in female labor force participation rates, and then we basically stagnated. I saw recently that Japan's labor force participation rate for women is now higher than the U.S., quite an amazing number. A lot of this is related to flexible workplaces and to child care and to parental leave. And there is really going to be a push on those issues in the election. And I think that's right, because I think among American voters, among American citizens, there's an agreement. Yeah, most women that they know have had employment at some point in their career, and it's been incredibly difficult, regardless of whether you're an upper income level woman or a very poor woman, to figure out what to do with family care and family leave. So I think this is going to be a big issue. But I do think labor force, the other thing I would say, and I know Jason's been working on this too, is I think the move to try to encourage more free community college, to basically think about ways to structure community college education so that it's more targeted to workplace needs, that we've got to think about ways to provide pathways for people into the labor market that are a bit more targeted pathways. And I think there's a really interesting stuff being done at the level of states on this, so I'm optimistic that that may be part of the solution as well.
Doug?
There's really a twofer on this. I mean, we know that the dividing line between being poor and non-poor in America is work. And so having a very pro-work social safety net, EITC is our biggest success, for example, in that front, both helps us with the poverty problem and it helps us with the labor force participation problem. That ought to be the focus of everything we do.
I should tell everybody that John McCain backstage said that no one should listen to Doug because he advised him on the economy in 2008 and it didn't work out.
I advised Hillary.
I'll
I did
give you
Hillary in 2000.
And I should tell you that John McCain didn't listen to me, so you should listen to me.
Income growth is relatively moderate, again, despite the a decent recovery. Why is that, and what can be done to make a difference?
I think there's three factors mechanically that go into it. One is the labor force participation we've been talking about that's been trending down. For a while, as women surged into the workforce, you had more two-earner families, and that helped offset some of our bigger challenges. Now it's not. The bigger ones are the productivity of our economy isn't high enough, and that productivity that we do have isn't being shared well enough. There's too much inequality. And so we need an agenda that operates on all three of those. There's not any one cause of the slow growth in incomes we've seen over the last several decades. We need expanded trade, business tax reform, more infrastructure, more research to increase our productivity. We need a higher minimum wage and EITC, more progressive taxes to deal with inequality. We need everything we've been talking about, flexible workplaces to help labor force participation. But those are the three levers I think we should be organizing our thinking.
How realistic are any of those things given that Congress struggles to pass a budget, which should be the bottom line thing that any government does?
Trade, for example.
Yeah.
We are trying to bring to closure a successful Trans-Pacific Partnership. We got the authority from Congress and the instructions about how to negotiate on that. The Senate passed a highway bill. There's a lot of ways you could build on and improve on it, but that's another way to move forward. So I think Congress can do things, but I certainly think we need to be doing a lot more than we're doing right now.
Doug?
I really think that the focus should be on the poor outlook for the trend rate of economic growth in the United States. CBO has it pegged at 2.1%. That's the number one problem that should be addressed. And that's a problem that has to be dealt with deep structural reforms. These are the entitlement reforms, the tax reforms, immigration reforms, the education reforms, which take a long time and the political world's not very patient about, but need to happen. That should be the focus of the policy agenda, and that is 180 degrees away from how Congress is operating on this day-to-day basis.
I only want to say two things in response to this. One is that we need to understand that there has been a great deceleration of growth around the world. This is not unique to the United States. And indeed, if you look at 25-year growth rates up to 2007, 2008, and where we are likely to be over the next 25 years, right now you'd say significantly lower. You absolutely would. The potential growth rate in the United States, because we've had essentially zero productivity growth for the past couple of years, would be essentially 0.5% if you actually, So I think I agree with the notion that is the basic challenge. I would just say, relative to your list of structural reforms, since this is shared around the world, I would be hard-pressed to make the arguments that entitlements in the United States or entitlement reform have anything to do with the productivity slowdown. I do think that issues in infrastructure spending, R&D spending, capital investment by business in the United States and around the world has been really quite slow for a recovery period. So we've had a balanced, consistent, but very slow recovery. And one of the statistics I've seen recently is, why is productivity growth so low? Well, if you look at capital services per employed hour of work, that's been declining. That has been declining for the last 5 years. We haven't made enough investments in the capital services that work with workers to make them more productive. So I think the business agenda for investment is a big one. That's something Doug and I work on together in terms of what should be our corporate tax reform. What should we do to make it more attractive to invest in the United States, bring the capital here? That also relates to the Export-Import Bank.
When you talked about the growth rate, can I ask you about Jeb Bush's plan to raise growth to 4%? I mean, is that a realistic goal, or is that just an aspirational goal that you come out with on the campaign trail to make people feel like you're being bold and ambitious?
I think it's closer to the latter. I mean, on this stage and in this auditorium, people know the difference between 3, 5, and 4, and just how hard it is to move average growth rates by half a percentage point. I don't think the average American is tuned into that. What they hear is he wants to grow faster, and boy, that'd be great.
Yeah. Right. The U.S. has grown now for 7 years. At some point, there will be another recession, whether people like it or not. But rates are pretty much maxed out on the low side. There's no appetite in Congress for any kind of stimulus. So are you worried that if we do enter another recession, that the policy tools are not going to be there?
When I think about the fiscal side, which is the part I pay attention to, I think there is no economic obstacle at all to using fiscal policy to address any future contingencies. I think there's a very serious political obstacle to it in terms of political will. And that's why I think one of the important things we need to be doing is strengthening what are called our automatic stabilizers, the things that kick in regardless of whether Congress acts. So unemployment insurance, for example, the tougher an economy is, the more of a rationale there is for letting people stay on their unemployment benefits a little bit longer, because it's probably not the benefits that are keeping them from getting a job, it's that there aren't enough jobs out there. We did that through congressional action this time. Next time that should happen automatically, and the president made a proposal that that would happen. So those types of ideas, I think we could be preparing now for whatever contingencies we face in the future.
So I would actually say in that respect, right now, I think the greatest risk to a global recession and to a recession in the U.S. is not U.S.-based, it's China-based. And I think that as I said, we've had a slow and quite balanced and consistently growing economy. It's hard to see where the recession trigger would come in the United States. You don't see the imbalances, you don't see the inflationary pressure, you don't see sort of the notion of the Fed having to move aggressively against inflationary pressure to slow things down. So I think the risk is from the rest of the world, and particularly from China. And of course, what I would say there is they do have the policy tools to handle this. They absolutely, whether you're talking about reserves or fiscal room, debt limits, anything you want to talk about, they have the tools to do it. What was unnerving about what happened in the last 6 or 7 months is they made some errors which people said, really, they're doing that? That doesn't seem consistent with their very sound macro management track record. Okay. So the other thing I will say, the unemployment compensation point is a very important one, because to go back now to how do we deal with a recession, let's say it's an imported recession, it's not our cause. We really do need to reform that, because people need, the time of replacement of income is short, the amount of replacement of income is short, and the restriction on what you can do, for example, to be trained, trained while you're getting unemployment compensation.
Yeah.
You know, some of the best unemployment compensation systems in the world really reside in the Nordic countries, and they have massive training during unemployment. They have they have very active labor market policies to try to match people with jobs. So you've got to build around the automatic stabilizer. Again, this point of how you get people on the track to new jobs.
Doug, did you want to add something on China?
Yeah, I mean, I think the diagnosis of where the shock comes from is really important. And, if it's a financial shock, domestic or international, the Fed can still do a lot of things, and so I'm not concerned on that front.
Okay.
The track record on discretionary fiscal policy is just basically dismal in the United States. So their inability to exercise that doesn't trouble me very much. Automatic stuff should work.
Yeah.
I mean, those are the key.
Last question, and I can't ask Jason because I know he won't be able to answer this, but my wife is an economist, and she says you never ask an economist to give a number and a time. They don't know how to do it. But let me ask you both, when is the Fed going to raise rates and by how much? And this is being televised globally, I believe.
So one thing I will say the Fed has been absolutely clear about is whatever they do will be in small steps and gradual. And I have known Janet a long time, and I know her experience when she first came on board in the Fed in the 1990s. She is not a fan, and I think a number of people on the board are not fans of big rate increases that are shocking to the system. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is if you really think, and I think we do, that the potential growth rate of the United States is significantly lower than it was in in the 25 years up to 2007, say, then the interest rate to which they will move is going to be considerably lower because that equilibrium interest rate depends upon what you think the nominal growth rate of the United States is. And if you think it's going to be significantly lower, the steps are going to be smaller and the rate you get to is going to be lower. So I think we know that.
I'm going to have to introduce you to my wife, I think, because we're out of time. Let me quickly ask Doug for his.
Go ahead. So I don't have to say when, thank goodness.
25 basis points next meeting.
Next meeting. All right.
There you go.
On that note,
All right.
thank you very much, everybody. Thank you to the panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.